I'm presenting along with Dr. Wendy Hoskins, and my name is Heather Dahl. So thanks so much for coming, and we hope you get something out of this.
I'm excited to see some familiar names that are joining us, so welcome back. And to those new names that maybe we haven't worked with together, hopefully this is the first of many times to come. As we started today, we just want to say a big thank you, a sincere thank you to each of you. We recognize that whatever you're already doing is a lot. And we know that you are already checking in and concerned about our students, which is a vulnerable population. And we also recognize that you are already a part of the solution. So keep in mind that we want to respect that and honor that today. And hopefully we can provide you with a few tools that will help you along in your process.
This is a pretty big topic, and we were just talking about this a little bit before the presentation, knowing that we only have an hour to talk about things that we could probably talk days for. So what we tried to do is focus on a few things that both of us have found helpful in our work. I'm trained as a clinical mental health counselor. Wendy's trained as clinical mental health and school counselor. And so we have a lot of experience to bring to this, and also things that we found maybe more helpful than others that we want to talk about today. So we're going to focus first just on our initial thoughts. So things that we want to maybe if you take just a few things from today as we get going to be thinking of. We're going to take a really tiny little look at statistics, just some things to keep in mind as we're moving along. We all know this is an important topic, and none of these statistics are going to be new to anybody, but I like to hear them and think about them over and over because it helps bring the call to action for me. We're going to talk about cultural awareness and values and different things to think about when we're working with our children and adolescents. We're going to talk about risk factors and protective factors and show you a handout that we've made that will hopefully help with that. We're going to talk about the hardest part, which is intervening with a child or adolescent, and we're going to leave you with some resources at the end of this. And you might have seen a little bubble that came up at the beginning of the presentation. This is being recorded, so you can watch it over and over again. So going into initial thoughts, we acknowledged this just a couple slides ago, that we recognize how much everybody that's coming to this presentation has already done. And many of us here in the room have been affected by suicide in one way or another. It may be someone that was a friend, maybe you've interacted with students who have expressed suicidality. It's something that's unavoidable. And so it's also something that can weigh on us as we move through this. We always want to remind people not to be afraid to ask if you're concerned about someone. There's nothing wrong with putting it out there in a empathic response, and we'll give you some language for that later on. Also using plain language when we're asking about suicide. This can vary culturally, so it's really important to make sure you're culturally attuned to the person that you're working with, but you want to be specific in your conversations with whichever appropriate for the person that you're working with. I always find this comforting that those who attempt or complete suicide have often exhibited some form of help-seeking behavior at one time. So the issue with that is you may be the first person that person is reaching out to, and there's a lot of weight behind that. It's also something that I take really seriously, and whether we like it or not, if you're a parent, a caregiver, a school bus driver, a school counselor, a front desk person, you might be the first person that a student reaches out to and says, hey, I'm going through something. And with that, just recognizing that risk factors are varied, complex, and really individualized to each person, which can make it feel overwhelming, but it also helps guide the decision-making process when you're working with somebody.
So let's talk a little bit about cultural awareness and values. What I'm really hoping to highlight now is for each of us to be thinking about our lens, right? Our cultural awareness, our values, and how they may match or create a barrier to or open our acceptance and understanding and desire to learn from those who have different cultural awareness, right? Or come from different cultures than ours. And then as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about two categories of building cultural awareness and values. The first one is really within your school. How are you building a school culture, if you will, that really supports the desire for mental health and wellness and supports and encourages all students to know that they have a right to seek mental health support? All of us in the helping professions know that there have been many roadblocks to that, right, over the years. And there's still stigma associated to mental health, even the way we within a school system. So this becomes really important. We also want to identify safe spaces that can be identified within our school. And these safe spaces might be particular areas, maybe the counselor's office, for instance, but it can also be individuals. Who's willing to be a safe space for any child who wants to say, I need help, right? Also, our caregivers that our K-12 students are living with, they may also need support. They may also need to know how to help their children who are experiencing suicidality. So how are we supporting our stakeholders within our larger community, and how are we promoting that information? Second category is being sensitive to your individual student, their culture, and their views on mental health and suicide. There might be hidden ideators that we need to find ways to broach, to find more about, as well as broaching values with them. How do they value mental health? What is their lens telling them? What is their experience telling them? We also need to be acknowledging racialized trauma, historical trauma. Right now with Black Lives Matter, it's been going on for a long time, but we seem to be focusing more attention now, which is great. And we need to continue those conversations in our schools with our individual students. Also consider looking at family history with mental health and mental health services. Sometimes people base all of their ideas on mental health with one interaction with one helping professional, and that may not be a positive experience. That trickles down as well. So keep those things in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation.
Going off of what Wendy just said, we wanted to just alert you, like I said, to a few statistics. There are so many more, but we were specifically thinking for children and adolescents. And we were also thinking Nevada versus the United States. So in comparison to the United States, where is Nevada at? We know a lot of you in the webinar may not be in Nevada, but since we're at UNLV, we wanted to take just a minute to focus on some specific Nevada pieces as well. So in Nevada, for 12 to 19-year-old children, it's the first leading cause of death. It's the second leading cause of death for those that are 20 to 44 years old. But when you break down that group a little bit more, the first leading cause of death for 12 to 19, which is alarming. And when it's the second leading cause of death, the first leading cause of death is accidental. So it's still very alarming. Within Nevada, we have the 11th highest rate of suicide in the nation, with 19.3 per 100,000 deaths. And Nevada, as a state, is currently ranked 51st for access to care and mental health treatment, which is the lowest in the nation. And that's not quality of care, it's access to care. So we're talking about just we have a really low level of availability with our mental health care workers. In the United States, suicide is the second leading cause of death for those 10 to 24 years of age, with a rate of 13.4 per 100,000 deaths. When I say there's so many other statistics I would like to get to that we just don't have time to talk about, one is LGBTQ populations, trans populations have much higher rates of attempts and completions than their cis counterparts. Racial disparities exist. I just highlighted a couple that I always find especially horrifying. African American youth aged 12 and younger are more likely to die by suicide than their white peers. And rates of suicide in Indigenous youth ages 10 to 24 are 3.4 times higher than the national average. That can go up depending on the region that you're talking about and can be quite a bit higher than that. And I think we often talk about suicide completions, but one of the things we don't always get to is just attempts. For every adolescent that dies by suicide, it's estimated that 100 to 200 have made an attempt. And so that's quite alarming and something to be keeping in mind when we're looking at our students, looking at our children and adolescents, and thinking, could this happen to us?
Okay, so thinking about risk factors that lead to suicide attempts, right? That last number that Heather gave us is pretty alarming at how many rates of attempts. So I'm going to have you now participate a bit, if you will, in the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's something called Q&A, and there's an open section, and it's a place where you can add questions, but I'm actually going to be asking you to provide some answers for us. And I'm going to be looking, and I'll give you about 60 seconds to respond in just a moment. What I would like you to write in that Q&A are what you consider to be risk factors of suicide for children and adolescents. Maybe these are risk factors that you have experienced yourself, your loved ones, or children that you're working with have provided risk factors. All right, so go. Provide me with some risk factors. You've got 60 seconds. All right, you're fast. I'm going to read through some of these, and then we're going to have Heather talk a little bit more about some risk factors. So some of the original ones coming in, trauma in early childhood and adolescence, emotional, physical abuse, home life, neglect, separation from a primary caregiver, isolation, self-harm perhaps, family problems, loss of a parent, abuse, bullying. We've got a few patterns emerging here. Drastic change in behavior, being more removed, isolation, pressure from school and family, more isolation, use of drugs, lack of support, genetic loading, low income, sleep, eating habits changing, dropping grades, feeling of hopelessness. You are hitting all of them. The list goes on and on. So Heather, talk to us a little bit more about risk factors.
Yeah, I mean, I think risk factors are the things I think we hear about most often when we think of suicidal ideation, because that's the scary part, right? Like these are all the things that we're alerted to that we need to take seriously. When we say just the term risk factor, it just refers to the factors that can contribute to an increased risk of suicide. These are not all encompassing. Not every person that experiences suicidal ideation will have one or more or all or none of these, but there are things that increase that risk and attune you to that person a little bit more and say, I might need to watch them or I might need to have a conversation. And so we created a handout that we hope will help with when we're thinking fast facts, right? We're sitting in our office, we're sitting at a coffee shop, and we're talking to a student and we realize something might be going on. Here is one thing that we can use. So this is a uh, form that just says risk factors of suicide for K-12 students. When I think of risk factors, I think about things that are happening at the individual level, at the relationship level, and at the community society level. And each of us can contribute to each of these levels, but it's important to think about when we're going through this list with a client or with a student, that we're thinking about this in multi-tiered approaches. So the first risk factor is just previous attempts, which makes sense, right? So has the individual or student attempted suicide in the past? That puts them at a higher risk factor, a risk level of doing it again. Hopelessness or isolation. I noticed in one of the Q&As, people had talked about COVID, which we'll get to in a little bit. But when we're more isolated, it can lead to hopelessness. It can lead to a lot of these pieces coming up. Mental health warning signs. This is very general, but we're talking depression, we're talking anxiety, um, we're talking adverse childhood experiences. So if we're familiar with ACEs, previous trauma that's happened, a history of trauma, and that trauma can be physical, it can be historical, racial, post-traumatic. There's a lot of different types of trauma that could contribute. And substance use. And when we say substance use, that could be changes, that could be drinking too much, it could be taking drugs, but it could also be eating food or doing things that might be different than what is normal for that child or adolescent. At the relationship level, I know a lot of you mentioned like current family stressor transitions. Are they experiencing houselessness? Are they separated from their caregivers? Are they in just a situation that's unhealthy? And that leads to this lack of supportive relationships. So, are they having issues keeping friends, keeping family members that may be someone that can support and mentor? What's happening with their relationships? Are they isolating from those relationships and not reaching out when a friend texts them or wants to play basketball out in the backyard? A family history of suicide and mental health issues. Again, this isn't all encompassing, so this may or may not have an impact on the child or adolescent. But if we're thinking about how that's impacted them, maybe they had a parent who died by suicide, and maybe that changes their perspective on it, or feels less risky to them because they've experienced it. And then a high conflict in relationships. That could be with caregivers, that could be with parents, that could be with their friends. Maybe it's a bullying issue. There's so many different components that can lead to that unsafe feeling. At the community and society level, there's quite a few different pieces that have more specific identifiers, but this overt shame related to suicide and mental health issues. Is there shame surrounding the idea of not succeeding in something or not following through on something that you need to follow through on? I need to get all my A grades, or I need to get that gold medal in track and field. And the shame that might come with not hitting those benchmarks. Um, Barriers to mental health issues. This one can be also be physical health. So if they can't get appointments for doctors, but if they try to make an appointment with a counselor and they're 8 weeks out, that's a barrier and that can be a risk factor. Limited support and safety resources available within the schools, within community, maybe they aren't able to access things that they would normally access. With COVID, a lot of things are closed down. There's a lot of pieces that might limit the support available. And then, as always, a risk factor is availability of lethal means. And lethal means can mean a lot of different things. That might not just be a gun or a knife. It could be the medication in your medicine cabinet. It could be, um, your Windex under your sink. So just really thinking about that. Wendy, do you have anything to add to any of the risk factors?
No, I think you've covered most of them, and you hit most of them also from the Q&A. But
Okay.
I guess I would just go back and reiterate a couple of the things that you said, like availability of lethal means, right? That is one that we do forget about, what can be lethal, right? So I think that was a good one to end on.
And then one of the things that we're talking so much about children and adolescents, but there's so little research done on suicide in ages 10 and under, that it makes it a lot harder to identify. This can feel really frustrating to parents. This can feel really frustrating to school counselors. There's a lot of helplessness that can feel with helping a younger kiddo that is going through some things and we're just not sure what to do. And so I think the important piece is to just take every symptom seriously. If you see something that's a change, monitor the change. Ask for help, ask for resources. Here are some things that have been shown to be increased risk factors specifically for 10 and under. It could be mild physical symptoms, for example, stomach aches or headaches, changes in eating or sleeping, behavioral outbursts, mood changes. And when I say mood changes, that could be anything from irritability, depression, anxiety, anger, sadness, confusion. Um, Play that involves the topic of suicide. I know Wendy's, when we've talked about this, talked about sand tray, and she might give a little example of that here.
Mhm.
And then beginning to display impulsive actions. That could be, I'm frustrated and I'm angry, and now I'm going to go run out into the street. So just really monitoring that. Wendy, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sand tray piece.
Sure. So particularly with young kids 10 and under, it's really important if you are engaging in some sort of therapeutic relation and you're using either play therapy or sand tray, something where you're really tracking what they're doing, right? Those of you who are familiar with play therapy in general have heard that term tracking. And it's really a process of literally tracking everything they're doing. And sometimes it feels parroting, like now you're picking up a gun. Now you're picking up a figure. I see you're putting that figure in the corner of the sand tray. Tell me about that, right? It's very simple. We don't dictate, we're not interpreting, but we're tracking, we're following. And what I have found is sometimes children will play out their emotions that they don't have the words for, or they play out the problems that they're experiencing, but they don't know how to talk about, or they don't know who they can talk about it. And so it comes through their play. So if you have a play therapy room, or if you have a sand tray and you have certain items that could be seen as weapons, or the child can decipher as a weapon, or a bottle of alcohol, or a bottle of pills, or the Windex, as Heather was referring to earlier, whatever that is. And if they're talking about somebody dying or being dead, for instance, I had a client and she would always bury herself in the sand, and then she would put the rest of the manipulatives and other people in her world on top of the sand. She was showing that what would happen if she were dead, right? So that's an image that I knew that I needed to track, and she was under the age of 10. So sometimes we think children under the age of 10, they have nothing to worry about, right? Big problems will come later in their life. But those little kiddos are having some serious thoughts and some serious emotions. and they don't always know how to tell us. So we have to watch in how they play.
Thank you. I could
So
hear
now we've
Wendy
been,
talk about, oh, go ahead.
no, sorry. So now we've been talking a lot about risk factors also. Heather, can you tell us a little bit about just how that's being compounded by COVID-19? And one of the questions we had was, has the data changed over the past year with COVID and lack of connection with peers in particular?
Yeah. That's such a complicated question, and I feel like we are still gathering data on that. I've been doing a lot of work around COVID-19 and looking at different things that are happening that may have happened during pandemic, but also what's going to happen post pandemic. And so the short answer is yes. I think we have increased mood disorders, increased anxiety, depression. I think we've seen increased substance use. I think we could estimate that we've seen increases in completed suicides, but it's also a little early to tell. There is data that suggests that. I know in Nevada, one of the reasons that we're doing this presentation, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we've had quite an influx of adolescent suicides within the last year. And I think the concern wasn't as much the number, because the numbers are similar to numbers in previous years, but that burst of when they occurred in that beginning of the school year, in that first semester time period. So I think that's something to just be aware of. I think anytime we're put in situations that are scary and that lead to impulsive actions, we have to assume that there's a heightened risk. So my assumption is always there's a heightened risk when something scary is happening, and I don't know what's scarier than a global pandemic and all of the things that are happening right now. And so just being really attuned to that when we're working with kiddos is really important. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is you may have that have been concerned about a student or a child pre-COVID-19, right? So there may have been things going on for that child. Maybe they were experiencing houselessness. Maybe they just had insecure housing. Um, there were other heightened risks at home, and that may have increased during COVID, right? And then they also lose some access to resources that they had pre-COVID because they could go to school each day. There were different things that were there, and so just being really, I think, attenuating to that change. And I know it can feel very helpless on the side of the person assessing what to do in this case. But there are different things we can look for. First of all, just acknowledging the heightened risk in the home for so many students. Students that are having to stay home may be experiencing more physical or verbal abuse. There may be more neglect. They may be having to stay home all day alone. They may be having to make lunch for their siblings. They may not have access to internet. There's so many different pieces that can contribute to that. They may not be able to make lunch for their siblings, right? There could be food insecurity. I know a lot of schools have really attempted to mitigate this, but it's still a concern for so many students. And then students who are experiencing houselessness before COVID, that may have been compounded with COVID. So we may be having more students and more kiddos that don't necessarily have a consistent home life, or maybe a consistent caregiver right now. And with that, this is something we all know, but it felt wrong not to put it down on paper. Our kiddos are suffering from increased isolation from peers, school, and community support. No matter how hard we try, that's just a fact. It is what is happening right now. And I think there's lots of things that you're already doing that's mitigating this, but it is something at the end of the day that's still happening. And that increased isolation, there's just a lack of access to outside supports, right? It might be you can't go to school to see your friends, you can't go to school to see your school counselor. Maybe you can't go to mental health appointments anymore and you don't have an internet connection, so you can't do telehealth. You can't get the physical medical care that you need. And these all increase risk factors for suicide, and just more things to be aware of when we're working with clients or students or children. Or our children, right? Our own children, if we're parents, these are things to just be monitoring and seeing how our own children and the children around us are working through this. These risk factors are just risk factors. Different students have different ways to mitigate that, which leads us to our next piece.
Right before we move on to protective factors and solutions, Heather, we have a question in the box talking about, can you talk about the difference between a risk factor and a symptom? For some of us, is it simply how we define, right, and use those terms?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's probably more interchangeable depending on who you're talking to. I think a risk factor could be experiencing houselessness, but a symptom could be increased depression, right? So maybe it's just the type of piece that you're talking about. And I think as we go along, that question may answer itself when we get to kind of where we go from here. But Wendy, if you can remind me to come back to that at the end and make sure we've answered it.
Sure. Yep. So we've been talking about risk factors, right? That we're aware of, what we need to be watching out for. And we've been talking about both risk factors and some symptoms as well. So now I'm going to be asking you in a moment to go into the Q&A again. But this time I'm going to be asking you, what are some protective factors that you have seen children and adolescents being able to use to help protect them, right? To help build some blocks that protect them from suicidal ideation. And we've already got our first one. The rest of you have 60 seconds.
I love how speedy everyone is.
And I'm just going to start reading these as we go along. Protective factors include friends, relationships, specifically with adults, maybe trusted adults, giving them the attention that they're needing, strong ties to the community, letting know simply that children are loved and they are not alone. How powerful is that? Therapy is an option, providing role models, being involved in activities, focus on goals in the future, access to supportive peers and adults, both. We know as children get older, those peer relationships become very valuable, right? Strong social support, doing well in school, open communication. Again, we're starting to see some patterns here with more support, family, friends, peers, adults, activities, listening to them, reminding them that they are valuable, a sense of belonging, validating their feelings, right? Whatever they're talking about, we validate rather than try to eliminate or squash. And resources, as well as high self-worth as well. I know I didn't get you all, but I got a lot of them. And less access to dangerous substances and weapons. We'll stop there. So Heather, talk to us a little bit about protective factors.
So as I mentioned before, I think we spend so much time on risk factors. Sometimes we forget about the protective piece. So I know one of the questions was, what are protective factors? And they're my favorite thing to talk about when we talk about suicide risk and suicide prevention. It really refers to factors that can contribute to reduce suicide risk. A protective factor promotes strength and resiliency in children and adolescents who might be experiencing suicidal ideation. I like to think of them as building blocks, that if you just think of a building block that surrounds us as a protection, maybe like a superhero bubble, right? And the more building blocks we have, the stronger our bubble is. And so again, we made a handout for you that I think can be helpful. It really is a bunch of building blocks. And so, again, we're looking at that individual level, that relationship level, and the community and society level. So, these are things we can do for ourselves, we can do with each other, and we can do for the community around us. So, increased self-esteem is a big one. And I think a lot of the comments for protective factors listed things that could increase self-esteem in a child, right? Listening to somebody, working on building up that self-esteem, cultural and spiritual beliefs. If a specific cultural or spiritual belief leads you to have I hate to say a negative view of suicide, but a resistance to attempting suicide because of those beliefs, that can be a strong protective factor in actually attempting suicide. One unique piece with children and adolescents as opposed to adults is this ability to problem solve. So, suicide can be very impulsive. It can be something that happens in the moment. You're not giving it a lot of thought, you're just doing it. And that ability to problem solve and think through, do I need to do this right now? Can I go ask for help? Can I go talk to somebody? That's huge. And so, if we're looking at our kiddos and we're wanting to teach them something, that's a really good use of our time, right? Is what does problem solving look like? I notice a lot of people said sense of belongingness, right? I belong here. I'm not a burden. I'm worthwhile. I'm worthy, and I'm here. And coping skills, which I think go along with that sense of belongingness and ability to problem solve, that I can soothe myself through this. I can deal with this. This is a really bad thing that happened, but I can work through it with those other protective factors that I have. At the relationship level, a lot of you mentioned different pieces here. So that family support system, having a secure home life, supportive parents, supportive caregivers, supportive siblings, right? So people around you that you feel like you can go to, that you can talk to, and that support you in your life. In general, that goes with supportive relationships. So I know a lot of people mention friends, right? Having someone to talk to that's not your family, having someone to play basketball with, knowing that you can talk to them and you might not feel judged. And you can say, hey, I'm going through a rough time right now. Do you mind if I share something with you? And that person being supportive and listening. I think this reasonable expectations from adults has really been sticking with me as I've been making this presentation. We've been talking about this, that we don't expect so much out of a child that they're afraid to tell us when they're not hitting that mark. Um, and just being there to say, it's okay, let's talk about it. It's okay you got an F. It's okay didn't make that track and field piece. And just positive social environments. So I know on the risk factors, we talked about conflict. Positive social environments is kind of the antithesis of that, right? So more harmony in your environment. Maybe have discussions that are positive, and when you're working through conflict, you're modeling a positive conflict environment. So we can work through something, we can get to a solution together. At the community and society level, just being able to access your school counselor. This can be something in Nevada, we have 544, the school counselors in here know this already. We have 544 students to one school counselor on average in our district. When best practice is 250 to 1. So when you have less access to the school counselor because they're so busy and so overwhelmed, that that's the opposite of what we want in a protective factor. So we want that 250 to 1. We want that 1 to 1, right? We want the school counselor to be able to do the work that they're trained to do. Along with that, access to mental health services, right? So if I'm feeling sad as a kiddo, I can tell my parents, and my parents can call a counselor, make an appointment, and get in tomorrow, right? Like that's important, or just be able to get there. A safe and supportive school and community environment. So we talked about this at the beginning. We talked about cultural values, but really being intentional about how we make our school setting and how safe and supportive that environment feels. And that's the same with community. So if you're in a youth group, are you making sure that you're opening up conversations that feel supportive and non-judgmental? If you're at a community center, are you giving that space? And then on the flip side to access to means, which is a risk factor, restricting access of lethal means, right? And we talked about this, somebody mentioned this in the Q&A, that idea of really thinking through, how do I protect the people around me and make sure that I don't have something that could be an impulsive decision around. Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
So just as if you're like me and you're visual, if you think of each of these like a block, right? Thinking of wooden blocks, I'm back in play therapy again. So imagine each of these as a block. Not everyone is going to have all of these, but if we can help anyone build a few of these blocks, the more blocks they have, right, the better protected they are. Not everyone is going to have equal opportunity to these building blocks. For instance, someone put in the question answer, what if family structure or parents are not safe? We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that's why this community social level is so important. Who are those safe people for that child, right? Where are those access points for mental health services or peer support? So keep that in mind, that not everybody is going to be able to achieve all of these, but the more of these that we can work on, the better. And someone else talked about, protective factor being teaching those coping skills. So, Heather mentioned coping skills here at the individual level. Maybe we need to expand how we are teaching and training coping skills in whatever capacity we're working in.
And I would just add to that, if I'm working with a student who may be expressing suicidality, I would bring this handout out. And what I've done with clients before is I would have a very similar to this, and we would go through each of these and talk about them. How is your self-esteem? Let's talk about your ability to problem solve. I noticed you were able to do that earlier. Do you feel like that's a protective factor of yours? Great, let's check it off. Why don't you sign your name there? And you make this something that they can hang up in their bedroom. They can hang up on their, I've had clients hang it up on their refrigerator to remind them of the strengths that they carry with them every day. And you're right, very few people are going to have each of these. I'm sure there's a protective factor on here that I'm like, oh, that's just not a strength of mine. But there's other pieces that I'm going to really connect with, and it's going to remind me when I'm working through something, I have a sense of belongingness. I know I belong here. I believe that in myself, and I'm going to hold on to that. So thank you, Wendy. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we do? I'm looking at the time. We can do something for 17 minutes. So we really wanted to think about an action-oriented approach that can be used by anyone at any time and modified to your own specific needs. One of my very good friends and colleagues, Dr. Shirley, who was Dr. Heimsch when she wrote this, created a beautiful model called the rescue model. We modified it. It's a database framework to work with children and adolescents. The original intention was for suicidality 10 and younger. And so the rest of this presentation will really take you through each of these steps with our suggestions under each one. So thank you, Dr. Shirley. First one is respond, and I think Wendy's going to take this as I say that out loud.
That's all right. So the main thing here, when we're thinking about a response and how do we respond, there's really kind of three moving pieces here, right, that we want to keep in mind. First, we want to make sure that we are providing a safe space or that the individual is in a safe space. If they're not in a safe space, how do we get them to a safe space, right? Some of us are Zooming with students right now. We're not seeing them in our office. And where they are, is their home a safe space, right? So we need to clarify that with them. And that's part of that action. Maybe we need to take action to help get them to a safe space or a safe space person, right? A point of contact. And this other piece is believe. We didn't want to make any one of these bigger than the others, but showing that you believe that the student what they're telling you is true and sincere is really, really important. They need to feel validated. And it also helps them understand this is serious. We know that some people will say things offhanded, like, well, then I'm just going to go kill myself because I can't deal with that. And sometimes we want to play that off as they're being dramatic, right? Even if we might have an indication that they're not serious, by us taking the topic serious, by asking them to clarify that we will believe them, we're modeling that this is a serious issue. So that way, the next time when they are more serious, or maybe they have a peer that's very serious, they know that you can be a point of contact that will believe them, take seriously, follow up to make sure they're in a safe space, and take action with them.
And potentially model that themselves for somebody else. So, starting a
Right.
good chain reaction of taking things seriously and not brushing off something that may be serious or may not be in
Mhm.
that moment. So the second piece is evaluate. And for evaluate, we were thinking of different things we could leave you with. Is Path Warm is an acronym that's very popular. It was developed for counselors. And we just thought this is something that's helpful. It's not the be all end all, but it's something you can take with you today. Different risk factors that you can go through in your head, remember these words, remember the word is or the words is path warm, and go through each of these in a way to determine, is this a risky situation and do I need to move forward? So we responded. Now the kiddo is saying, yeah, I'm actually, this is serious. So now we're going to do some minor assessing. This is something anybody can do. This isn't a counselor only resource. This is someone, if I'm walking on the street with a friend, this is something I could do with them right there. And is path warm is something that's nice, that's memorable, that we can remember, and whether or not we have it on our phone or we have it memorized, it can be helpful. So here's just some things you could think about as you're going through these risk factors. So the first is ideation. Does the child or adolescent present with ideation? Are they saying, I'm thinking about killing myself? Are they using words like, I'd be better off not here? What are they saying? And what, and again, going back to respond, believing that and moving to these next pieces. The S stands for substance use. Does the child or adolescent use substances, and is there a change or increase in that use? So, not necessarily, hey, they have a drink every now and then. It's, are they drinking differently than they had in the past? Are they eating or not eating? What is it about substances that has changed that has led you to think, let's assess here a little bit more? Purposelessness. We talked about this a lot, Wendy and I, because it can feel like kiddos, they're going to school, they're coming home, but purpose is a really big part of a child's life. Maybe that's playing their video games, maybe that's reading a book or texting with their friends. And are they not doing that anymore? Do they feel like it doesn't matter? Do they exhibit signs of anxiety at a higher level than they had in the past, or just anxiety in general? Does the child or adolescent feel trapped? I don't know what to do. Maybe something happened at school and they don't feel like they can go back and see their friends because it's so embarrassing and they just want to stay in their bedroom. And do they report hopelessness, right? Like I think that's a really important one. We hear about hopelessness a lot, but do they just not have anything that they want to live for anymore? Have they withdrawn from social activities? Were they someone that were texting their friends all the time and now they're just not? I know I keep using this basketball reference, but were they playing basketball outside with their friends every day and they just stopped doing it? Do they just not want to talk to you at night at dinner like they used to? These are things to monitor and talk to them about. Are they exhibiting increased anger? This can be something that can be harder to see, like knowing a child and knowing what anger is for them, and seeing if it's more than usual. Are there more outbursts? Have they been making reckless decisions? Have they been running out into the street? Have they been getting into a car and driving too fast and not caring if they're wearing their seatbelt? And have they exhibited any mood changes? Do they have more depressed mood? Are they feeling sad? Are they feeling down? Are they feeling all of the different feelings that you can think of that are significant changes from before? Wendy, is there anything to add to that? Okay.
No, you're good.
Moving on to safety. So we've now assessed the student using our ISPATH form, and we're worried about them. We think that there may be some risk factors. We've gone over our risk factors and our protective factors, and we just don't feel confident. This is where I'm asking something of you. So we want to ensure that a child or adolescent is safe. And I think one of the things we can do if we take something from this today is develop your own plan of action. So as you're sitting here thinking, well, if a child walked up to me and said something that concerned me, what would I do? Have Write something up for yourself. Walk through yourself through a plan of action. What do you need to have on your phone that might be helpful? Would printing off some of these handouts make you feel better as you're moving through something? So developing your own plan of action, knowing the resources in your area, is really important. And that could be something as simple as knowing those protective factors and risk factors and having a conversation and connecting them with a suicide hotline. Um, Knowing your own school policies and procedures is really important. If you work at a school, they have policies and procedures on this. We all know that. I know people in schools do so many gatekeeper trainings, and so this is not new information. But I think sometimes when we're so busy doing other things, we can forget that we can do some self action on our own past those gatekeeping procedures that might not be fully applicable to your situation. And knowing additional resources in your local area, we added some at the end of this presentation that we'll get to that are national. And I think I did one that's local in Nevada. But what's the hotline number? How do you contact the school counselor, the crisis response team in your area? And then identifying at least one other safe person for that student. That may or may not be you. And that's a harder conversation to have. If you are not that safe space person, then it's important to connect that student with someone who is a safe space that they can have these conversations with. And on the flip side, it may be you and it may be only you. And so having that conversation and really building yourself up to be able to work on that. I think one of the scariest things is doing something wrong. But we talk about this later. Action is always better than inaction. And just again, with COVID-19, recognizing that if you're on a Zoom call with this student, what's going to happen when you disconnect? That can feel very scary on your end. And it can be scary for this child too. And just making sure that we think about those COVID-19 factors when we're thinking about safety. With collaborate, we really want to, the idea of a safe space person, we want to expand that to a safe space team. It is impossible to do everything yourself and to be that person for everybody. The whole idea of building resiliency with a student is also, or with a child, is also connecting them to other or identifying other safe spaces for them. You're not alone in this process. And I think we're going to give you a little tool that we found helpful in creating that safe space team, or just understanding what the safe space team is for a child that you're working with. The other piece is breaking confidentiality. It's important that you have buy-in with the child. We'll go through that safe space worksheet, understand and follow the protocols of your school, and then think about wraparound services. So who's the primary caregiver for the kiddo? And then who are school mental health professionals, school counselors, school psychologists, school social worker, whoever's out there at your particular school that could be helpful in this piece. And when I say breaking confidentiality, if you're a mandated reporter, that means something different than if we're someone who may not be a mandated reporter. But for me, anytime someone tells me a secret, if I tell someone else a secret, I'm breaking confidentiality. And so it's important for me that if I'm talking to a friend and they're telling me something secret and I'm going to tell somebody else, that I'm going to spend a little time getting buy-in from that person before I tell somebody else. So Wendy's going to describe this safe space people worksheet, and we have 5 minutes.
Sure. So the main idea here is getting a child or adolescent to identify who their safe space people are. So sometimes I'll start with a sheet of paper and I'll have them put themselves in the center. And then I'll say, tell me your top 5 safe space people. And if they don't know what that is, or I don't want to talk about that, I'll say, who are the people that you're closest to, that you talk to, that you share with? And then the next point, maybe I'll have them put those individuals in relation to themselves on the piece of paper. So like in this example, you'll see mom is farther apart, neighbor Kim is really close. Wouldn't it be great information for a mom to know that she's got another safe space person in neighbor Kim that her child is willing to talk to? And so what we want to do with this information is not just help the child highlight who their safe space people are, but also share that information with those safe space people so that they know someone else that they can reach out to check on the individual themselves as well.
Thank you. So we're going to move through these next two a little quicker. So really understanding is really providing a space to listen to not only the immediate concern of the kiddo, but the long-term concerns now or as well. So they may have something that's right now bothering them that may be making them suicidal, that may be giving them that may be increasing their fears, anxieties, but there may be long term concerns as well. So, being able to sit in that with somebody is really important. Validating feelings, we can't emphasize this enough. I know we've all had our feelings invalidated at some point, and that feels crappy. We want somebody that's in a really tough, horrible spot to not feel like their feelings aren't validated. They may stop asking for help. They may shut down. We don't want that. And acknowledging experiences, no matter how small they seem. With a kiddo, something that could be life ending to them, literally, might not sound that bad to you, but that's not it. We're validating every experience as the most important experience for that person. And then I'm going to have Wendy just really quickly give you a couple examples of why we use empathy instead of sympathy in these moments.
Right. So just keep in mind, sympathy tends to translate that we don't trust that they can take care of themselves. And you might be sitting there thinking, anyone who's suicidal, I don't think they can take care of themselves, right? But we also want to provide a message that we have faith in them and that they have a reason to be here, right? More empathic. I can't understand what you're going through, but I want to stay in this safe space with you and I want to hear you out. I want you to tell me more about your experience. I'm listening to you. We can't undervalue that phrase, I'm listening enough, right? That can be the key for somebody.
Absolutely. And then finally, engage. So, like we've said, this is really beginning the next step. So we've walked through all of these pieces. Now we're going to act, because again, action is better than not action. We're going to begin the therapeutic process. As a school mental health professional, you may be the primary contact that's doing that for a child or adolescent. You may be the only person following up on that process. A primary caregiver may not be able to be that main source of support, and they may need their own therapeutic process and resource within that. And so we may be working with the child, we'll most likely be working with the child and their caregivers or parents. Really a big part of this is increasing that support system, increasing that safe space team for the child and adolescent. And an often forgotten part is that idea of aftercare planning. So being purposeful in your planning that's continuous and thoughtful, and connecting the child with support systems and resources, recognizing how individualized this process is and that a one size fits all does not work.
So we've got that last 60 seconds again. I'm going to ask you to go to your Q&A. What was it that jumped out to you? Was it the rescue model? Was it the protective factors, the building blocks? Was it something you hadn't thought of before and somebody highlighted, whether in the Q&A or something that Heather provided today? Was it the path warm? What is it that you'll be able to take away today that was helpful for you? And any last minute questions. We'll
And
take those too.
yeah, as we grab those questions and thoughts, we just want to provide you with some selected resources, the National Suicide Hotline in English and Spanish, the Lifeline chat, which is an online chat box, the crisis text line that can be a national number used anywhere in the country. Crisis Support Services in Nevada is a specific crisis support number here, and then our email addresses are at the bottom.
I did want to mention something that somebody brought up in the Q&A. Yes,
Mhm.
social media is also so powerful. That can be a
Yeah.
risk factor, and that can also be a building block. It's about having the conversation and talking about social media and what they're doing with social media. So thanks for our partner today who brought that up and brought that
Yes.
to our
Thank
attention.
you. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad everyone liked the resources. I'm looking through the comments. And have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.